I'll tell you a little bit about the unique type of shiur that we're going to give today. Story is potentially a bit apocryphal. I don't know the exact origins of it, but we're told that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, a personality many of us know, in his later years turned to his students and said, I need to go to Switzerland. The students were perplexed. They said, why? Why do you need to go to Switzerland? He says, I need to see the Alps. Students are like, what do you need to see the Alps for? And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch responded as follows, and there are different versions of it, but the kernel of the idea is there. He said, when I get up to Shamayim, the end of my years, God will ask me many questions, and I will have answers to many of them. But when God asks me, Nu, Shimshon, did you see my Alps? I need to have a good response. It's a beautiful story that kind of captures what I want to do here today. You see, this is our second virtual Yemei Iyun b'Tanakh, and all of us are listening to this Torah from inside of our homes, wherever we are. But I want to actually take us further than perhaps any Yom Iyun b'Tanakh has ever taken us before by giving us a little bit of a different type of source sheet. See, what we're going to do today, and I'll describe a little bit more of the concept behind it, is we're going to read through a famous mizmor, the one many of you are familiar with from Rosh Chodesh every month, Barchi Nafshi. And instead of reading the classical commentaries, what we're going to do is actually use pictures of real locations, of places that I've traveled to with my wife, as a way of interpreting the text. And the argument that I'm going to make is that this isn't just something fluffy or cute to do, but that this is actually chibat haaretz. I use those words very, very intentionally. You see, when we talk about chibat haaretz, we usually are talking about traveling around the land of Israel with a Tanakh in our hand. The argument I want to make is that while traveling through the land of Israel with the Tanakh in one's hand is the way to travel Eretz Yisrael, I think it's the way we need to travel through the world as well. In other words, by the end of this shiur, I hope to convey to you the way that the Tanakh has informed the way that I've seen the world, and the way that the world informs the way I understand Psukim and Tanakh. Is everybody with me right now? You with me right now? Okay, great. Let me share this unique source sheet with you. And I'll explain a little bit more before we delve into it. What I'm describing right now, I've coined for myself two types of learning. This is the introductory part we're in right now. And we'll pause for questions once we get into the real kishkas of it. I coined them Tze'u U'Re'u and Tashma. For those of you with a little bit of a rabbinic backing, you may get a little bit of the irony here. In Gemara, when we're learning and you want to bring another proof, we say the words Tashma, which literally translate to Bo v'tilmad, come and learn. Tashma implies sitting within the Beit Midrash, poring over a text and deeply understanding its meaning through perhaps classical literary reads, the classical way that we would think that somebody would debate a piece of text in the Beit Midrash. However, Tze'u U'Re'u, it's a text that maybe you know from Pirkei Avot, go out and see Haderech She'avor Lo Adam. Tze'u U'Re'u comes up in the Haggadah. The idea of going out and seeing is a different type of limud. It's going out into the world and seeing what we can glean from that as well. Here's the thing. I write here, Tze'u U'Re'u versus Tashma. But by the end, like I was saying, Tze'u U'Re'u should inform Tashma, and Tashma should inform Tze'u U'Re'u. In other words, all I'm doing right now is giving you a shorthand for these two different types of learning, the two different ways we're about to go through the shiur. Before we continue, I just want to make sure that everyone here has the source sheet. I'm putting the link here as well, and you can feel free to play with the source sheet. Here's what I mean. If you go through this source sheet, you will see that I did not put the English into this source sheet. Instead, what I did is the following. Click on any random verse, and you will see, oh, looks like there's a link to a photo. Here we are, the Antelope Slot Canyons. The Antelope Slot Canyons in Western America. And this picture, which I'm going to describe, is actually deeply conveys the meaning of the psukim in Barchi Nafshi. You can go through every single element of these mizmorim, and just click on any line, and there you go. Here we are, Vietnam, Sapa. We'll describe how each of these pictures brings out the meanings of the word. But again, I want to convey to you, I could never do this year if we weren't doing it virtually. The only way I could bring you as far as I'm going to bring you over the course of this year is by having us all sit in our homes. So you guys ready? Any questions before we go on? Any questions before we go on? Okay, so let's do this. Now, one more small thing. Oops, I'm giving you a little bit too much, too many pictures here. One more small thing before we begin. Now, in a classic Tehillim shiur, especially at the Yemei Iyun B'Tanakh, ones that I've given in past years, I would go through the overall structure of the mizmor of Barchi Nafshi. I would break it down. I would perhaps show where the first section ends, the second section ends. I do an analysis. What I'm going to do right now is almost a 1-minute analysis of Barchi Nafshi, an al regel echad analysis of Barchi Nafshi, and I'm going to do something different with you. We're not going to necessarily read and analyze beforehand. We're just going to read the psukim together, line by line. I'm going to talk about each location in each picture and the way it brings out the meanings in the words. Barchi Nafshi et Adonai, that we say each Rosh Chodesh. The reason I started doing this was because my wife, Michelle, who took most of these pictures and may show up in a couple of the photos, don't tell her, dragged me all around the world, at least initially reluctantly. But on our travels, whenever we would come to a new location, I would decide to recite Barchi Nafshi, even if it wasn't Rosh Chodesh. I would just say Mizmor Kuf Daled, Barchi Nafshi, because I knew deep down that Barchi Nafshi had to do with nature. It had to do with understanding or appreciating the world. But what ended up happening was, as we traveled to every location, different lines of Barchi Nafshi popped out. Different lines kind of just surprised me. They took on new meanings. What I like to say is, and this is important to any study of Tehillim, is that even after you do the analysis, anytime you read a Mizmor Tehillim, you can't remember that, you can't forget that it's a prayer. So I can't tell you to pray with me right now, but get in that mindset of praying through Barchi Nafshi. Perhaps as I'm going through my travels, you can think of some of your own that are highlighted in some of these photos. Here's the 1 minute on Barchi Nafshi, the analysis for 1 minute, and then we're going to go through some of the lines together. Barchi Nafshi, if I were to take a bumper sticker, a one line in Barchi Nafshi that encapsulates what it's all about, it's a line that comes up around 20 psukim in, Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai, kulam bechokhma asita, malah haaretz kinyanecha. It's a point where in third person in the Mizmor Tehillim, the Baal HaMizmor yells out and exclaims after seeing God's mighty creation, ah, how wondrous are your creations, God, or how many, different ways of interpreting. Kulam bechokhma asita. The word chokhmah here is very important, because that is really what comes at the center of Barchi Nafshi. Chokhmah is wisdom, or divine wisdom. And what we'll see throughout Barchi Nafshi is that the real theme of Barchi Nafshi, the real idea behind God's wisdom, is the fact that there is a seder. Everything is organized. Everything is perfectly calibrated. There are many who see the parallels between Maaseh Bereshit and Barchi Nafshi, because one of the messages, perhaps main messages of Maaseh Bereshit, is that everything has its order. Everything has its day. In Barchi Nafshi, we'll see the way that the Baal HaMizmor describes the way in which God has crafted in a world which is perfectly calibrated to sustain all beings that live in it. Wisdom in Barchi Nafshi is the divine wisdom that God utilized in creating and crafting a world where all of the pieces fit perfectly together. Now, interestingly enough, we're not going to focus on this today. There's actually another Barchi Nafshi, Mizmor Kuf Gimel. The two of them are meant to be read almost in unison. Kuf Gimel turns towards the way God interacts with the world in terms of law. The Yud Gimel Midot Rachamim actually play a major part here. Kuf Daled is more about the way that God interacts with the world and God's divine wisdom through nature. Here we go. Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Barchi nafshi et Adonai literally means let my soul bless God. It is interesting because if you think about the words, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, it is as if the Baal HaMizmor is in dialogue with himself. It is as if he took his nefesh or his neshama, took it out of himself, and he's talking to his nefesh. He's saying, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, my neshama, you must go and praise God after everything that I behold, after all of the divine wisdom. Here, I have to say what I've almost done here is written up a little bit of a prayer. This is actually my own Siddur, which I'm showing you here. You could zoom into it and the little moments that we're going to describe. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what's coming up. Barchi nafshi et Adonai. These are my own personal reflections on encountering Tehillim through God's world and encountering God's world through Tehillim. David's prayers and my own brought to life through experiences, travels, and meditations that have consistently ignited conversations with my soul. So I actually think a really nice way of translating Barchi nafshi et Adonai is conversations with one's soul, which in this Mizmor, in Kuf Gimel, it's ignited by something else, by seeing God's hashgacha pratit with human beings. Here it seems to be ignited by those beautiful views of God's wisdom in nature. All right, that's enough intro. It's 15 minutes of intro. Now let's get to the real meat of it. Barchi nafshi et Adonai, Adonai Elohai, gadalta me'od. God, you are grand, you are great. Hod v'hadar levashta. You are cloaked in glory. What does it mean to be cloaked in glory? In what way does God cloak himself in glory? It's actually pretty simple, and most of the Parshanut seems to say this. You think of the Me'il of Yosef. You think of a beautiful sunset. You think of the way that God envelops the world every single night. Hod v'hadar levashta is the Baal HaMizmor in a deep way, reflecting on what I saw here in Beaver Lake, upstate the Catskills in New York. A beautiful sunset, God enveloping the world with his own painting, his own divine fireworks. It's unquestionable what's being described here is something that God is cloaking the world in. And here it seems to be, in my opinion, Hod v'hadar, the beauty of a sunset. If you're not convinced by that, there's plenty more that I'll show you that will clearly bring out the pshat in even deeper ways. Let's keep it going. Ote or kasalma. Ote or kasalma literally means this. God cloaks himself in light as if he's wearing a piece of clothing. Ote or kasalma. I remember seeing this for the first time when I was traveling up in Banff in Calgary. If you see the way the light reflects here off the mountains in the background versus the ones in the front, you could almost see the divine games that God is playing as he's refracting his light in different ways off of his earth. Ote or kasalma. Undoubtedly, the metaphor here is capturing somebody who has a deep, deep understanding of the way that God plays with his light, the way that he uses his light to beautifully interact with the world. You guys get my drift? You see where we're going right now? You can definitely, like I said, you can move towards other pictures as we're going along. Some of these I'll bring out stronger shots, and I could talk about each of these locations more, but I want to keep on moving. Noteh shamayim kayari'ah. Have any of you ever stargazed? A beautiful dark night sky, no light pollution at all. Now, this is one of the few pictures I haven't taken, but noteh shamayim kayari'ah. You see a sky like a tent spread out, and the entirety of heavens is spread out in front of you. Noteh shamayim kayari'ah. You see all of the stars dotting the earth, and you're like, oh, look at this beautiful background God laid out for me tonight, right? Noteh shamayim kayari'ah, undoubtedly, is God laying out the heavens in front of us. That is a dark night sky in Bryce, one of the darkest places in the world outside of the Sahara Desert. Let's keep on going. Hamekare b'mayim aliyotav. So one of the beautiful things you could do as you go through these Mizmorei Tehillim, and this is one of the few pictures of myself and Michelle here, is you can actually trace water. You see, water initially it almost trickles through the entire Mizmor. Here it actually talks about in the Mizmor, just going back to the words, Hamekare b'mayim aliyotav. God freezes his water in higher places, and we will see how the water from up above provides to all those below. Now, you could think of this as heavenly, but I think in a deep way, and this is the way I've thought about it ever since visiting the Athabasca Glacier up in northern Canada. This Athabasca Glacier provides water for a third of the West Coast. Hamekare shamayim ba'aliyotav, undoubtedly in my mind, is referring to a glacier. Tell me, you can argue with me. This idea, there's frozen oceans of water that provide everything that is necessary for Earth. And you can see the water here slowly dripping. That's going to end up all the way in the Pacific Ocean, right? Providing water and energy to thousands, if not millions of people along the way. Hamekare shamayim ba'aliyotav. The next one. I hope you see what we're doing here. I'm giving parshanut, and you got to imagine, I see this, and I see the Athabasca Glacier, and I'm like, oh, Hamekare shamayim ba'aliyotav. But then I also see Hamekare shamayim ba'aliyotav, and I'm like, oh, the Athabasca Glacier. The next one's beautiful. Hasam avim rechuvo. Look at this image. This image is the following: God who makes wind his chariot. God who makes wind his chariot. Meaning, what is it that carries God around? What is it that carries God around? I remember when I went to the top of Cadillac Mountain in Acadia, we could not see anything in Acadia, no matter where we went. It was the highest point of Cadillac Mountain, but the clouds were everywhere. It was if God's chariot had enveloped where we were at the time, and there was nowhere we could go. There was nowhere we could go. It's as if we had sat on the God's divine chariot and we're trying to look down. But the next part really brings it down. Hamehalech al kanfei ruach. If you've ever been to a slot canyon on the West Coast, what's interesting about these canyons is they're not carved by water. They're actually carved very slowly. And some of you may have seen this as backdrops, and it's like a screensaver at certain points. These canyons are actually carved by wind, slowly, over time. Each of these striations that you see is actually the wind making its way through these narrow crevices in the ground. Undoubtedly, it is wind, the Mashiv Haruach Umorid HaGeshem, that in a certain way is the messenger of God, the silent messenger of God's power in the world. In fact, when we were there, the Navajo Indians talked about how the wind resided in these slot canyons, and there were all of these legends surrounding the Ruach, the unseeable forest that was there. And in fact, if you look at Barchi Nafshi, that's literally what it's saying here. Oseh malachav ruchot. God makes his angels or his messengers the wind. In other words, what is moving God's divine chariot? What is moving the winds? What is moving the clouds that we just saw? What is making them move around? what is it that's causing all of these natural forces, these hurricanes to shift? It's not nature. It's God using his messenger, the wind, to bring things about. Now, these striations in the canyon are a visible marker, a permanent kind of imprint of what this wind has done, but it's a reminder to me of the way God's wind is diverting and moving this water to the places that it needs to go. I hope you're with me right now. It's as if we've made it through sunrise. We've seen, probably I shouldn't describe it as a sunset. We've made it through sunrise. We're feeling God's waters. We're feeling moving winds that are moving clouds around. And this is if God, through all of these elements in nature, is conducting this divine symphony through his chokhmah. Let's keep on going. I'll pause it a little. I'll pause at another stage. Here we go. Misharet mishartav eshlohet. It's pretty clear what this is. Beforehand, we said his messengers are the wind, but I think in addition to that, fire, or the sword of fire, is one of his messengers as well. Here I have a picture of the following, and there are two ways I think of it. Either it's a lightning bolt, mishartav eshlohet, or mishartav eshlohet, as you can see also, the way that the clouds refract the light over the Grand Canyon here almost makes me think about you could see the red. It's almost like there's fire there. Mishartav eshlohet is God's divine messengers playing with. You kind of look through the clouds and you see the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is playing with the way we see things on earth. Great. That's the beginning of the Mizmor. Pausing. Is anybody confused at what I'm doing right now? I hope it's clear. I hope it's clear that what I'm doing right now is just conveying an alternative form of parshanut. I could talk more about each of these, but I'm trying to move through it. Yasad eretz al mechoneha bal timot olam va'ed. I didn't put the English here intentionally because I wanted you to translate along with me. God put the foundations of everything in its place so that it could not move from where it was. In other words, what I'm showing you right now are glimpses, small glimpses of nature in its totality, that God has set in place firmly since the moment of creation. And you'll see why that is so important and certain lines that are coming up soon. We got a divine process in order. The water right now is still hanging out by the glacier. We've got clouds moving around, light moving over everything, but nothing's really made its way to us, human beings, animals, at all yet. But here's where it comes down. Tehom kalavush kisito, al harim ya'amdu mayim. You see now that things are going to start moving down a little bit. These are called the Sunshine Meadows. These are lakes around 3,000 miles in the air, 3,000 feet in the air. The water that's being provided to these lakes here is actually provided by the Athabasca Glacier. And if you walk around in the Sunshine Meadows in Calgary, you actually see the water slowly trickling down, making its way through the mountains. Envision in your mind the water moving from the glacier to these lakes on mountaintops, which are literally the words here, al harim ya'amdu mayim. And now listen to what's going to happen next. Min ga'aratcha yenusun, min kol ra'amcha yechapezun. From your thunder they will flee, from your storms they will flee. From your roar they will flee, from your thunder they will run. In other words, what's being described here, it seems to be, is perhaps a storm, perhaps a landfall, perhaps snow tumbling down a mountain. You can hear the roar of the water as it's making its way down the mountain. Now, thank God I don't have any pictures of that. But min ga'aratcha yenusun min kol ramcha yechapezun ya'alu harim yerdu bekaot. Here what I have is a picture of the Grand Canyon. Now we all know the Colorado River has been spending millions and millions of years slowly carving its way through the Grand Canyon, making it a couple inches deeper every year. I don't have a perfect perspective looking down, But if you imagine to yourself the Athabasca Glacier having its water move down towards those waters in the mountains of Sunshine Meadows, and now I will admit to you that it's not exactly the exact water connecting here, but for creativity, we could say now the water is making its way down the Colorado River, the deepest point possible, slowly carving out the Biki'ah, this crack in the earth a little bit more, making its way towards the ocean. Hopefully you're feeling the progress right here of the water making its way down Min Hashamayim, where our Mizmor began, to the Aretz, where we are right now. There's a goal to all of this, of course. It's not just God playing with his own water toys, right? It's not just like, let's see if I could get the water to move around. All of this is there in order to sustain us. That's where the Mizmor is about to move. But listen to the following before we get there. El mekom ze yasarat alahem. The water is making it to the place where it needs to be. Gvul samta bal ya'avorun, bal yeshuvun lechasot haaretz. This goes back to the way that God has organized the world. One of the things being conveyed in this Mizmor, and I say this very carefully, we are not glorifying nature. We are glorifying God, who has organized nature, and we are glorifying the Seder that everything has. Gvul samtal bal ya'avorun, the boundary that is being described here that cannot be crossed is not the boundary to, get a visa to go into Israel nowadays. Probably harder these days. Gvul samtal bal ya'avorun is the following. Gvul samtal bal ya'avorun is the way that the water interacts with land nowadays. That no longer will the ocean ever overtake the land like it did in the time of the Mabul. You could see here the way the water is interacting with the land at Horseshoe Bend, but perhaps even more powerful, for those of you who ever been to Acadia and seen the rocks there, the water is bashing against the rocks, trying to almost make its way into land, and the land is almost standing there as a fortress saying, nope, not anymore. The Mabul happened, and we're not making this happen again. Maybe you felt this at a tide here and there, as the borders between land and earth are constantly shifting back and forth. But we have a guarantee from Kadosh Baruch Hu, Gvul samta bal ya'avorun. Everything seems to be in its place. Waters are making their way down. Mekom ze yasarat alahem. We're doing great. Different form of parshanut here, isn't it? Hamishaleach mayanim benechalim, bein harim yahalechim. I may have skipped a little bit in terms of where we got to the Grand Canyon, but imagine this. This is Yosemite Waterfalls. You can see the way that the water is cascading over a waterfall, the beautiful rainbow there too. We'll come back to that in a little bit, and making its way through the forest. And you could see the contrast between the mountains where there's nothing growing and the trees that are springing up everywhere where the water is making its way through. You see the way that the water is kind of making its way, turning its way through the mountains. The water is making its way through the mountains. It is giving to all those who need it. Here's a little bit of me playing a game here. This is Glen Canyon. This water reservoir was actually made by man. The canyon was flooded and provides water. Later on, the Hoover Dam is part of the water structure here that's keeping everything in place, but provides water for a lot of the Vegas area and the West Coast. So here I creatively talked about the Glen Canyon as us in a certain way playing with God's Maaseh Breshit and giving water to everybody, but on a deep way, Yashku Chol Chai Tosadai. All of these waters are providing sustenance for everything in the world. And here, I don't have the animal portion fully filled out. Next time you come back and I do this, I'll have pictures of everything, but just envision all of the waters are coming forward, providing food for everything. And Yisbe'u Pra'im Sma'am, the mules are being satiated. Alehem Of HaShamayim Yishkon, the birds themselves are, it seems like, living on the mountains or the trees. Mi bein ofayim yiknu kol. You hear the birds chirping as the water is going through. In other words, we've created an ecosystem here. God has created something that is livable. Mashkeh arim aliotav mi pri masecha tispa aretz. God And I'm not doing the literary parallels here. I could do an analysis of structure, the way Mekom Zeyasara Talahem comes back, Mashke Arim Eliotav, which saying the Mashke Arim Eliotav, that same mountain, that same water that has come through the mountains, Miprim Asecha Tispa Aretz, is providing sustenance for the entirety of the land. Here, what you see is actually a picture of Sapa, Vietnam. These are rice paddies and it's terrace farming. And if you look very closely, it's a little bit difficult to see, but they actually set up little canals going through the center of each of these rice paddies, bringing the water down to provide kind of the necessary irrigation for every single element of this terrace. Many of you maybe have seen the olive trees in Israel, have seen this type of terrace farming as well, but the water is making its way down, then making its way across. This is it, Mashke al Harim Eliotav, bringing the entirety of the environment to life. Matzmiach chatzir la behema, ve'esev la avodat ha'adam, le'otzi lecha min ha'aretz. I'll pause here for a second because what I want you to realize here is that in this Mizmor, unlike Mizmor Kuf Gimel, man is not at the center. You see, man is just part of this giant ecosystem or this giant world that God has created. With his chokhmah, he fits into it. Matzmiach chatzir lebehema. God creates grass for the animal. Ve'esev seems like grass la'avodat ha'adam. Seems like the grass that perhaps the animals need to consume for man to do his work, Lahotzi lechem min haaretz, in order to actually effectuate taking bread out of the ground. In other words, you see here how the human being is not the climax of creation, but he's part and parcel of it, and he's interacting with everything that God has done here to make things work. It's interesting here that it's very clear that Lahotzi lechem min haaretz is the foundation of the bracha that we're all familiar with, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. The irony, which maybe some of you have noticed before, is that Hamotzi lechem min haaretz is we are blessing God who took bread out of the land. Now that's a little silly because God doesn't take bread out of the land. If you know the 39 melachot of Shabbat, takes a little bit more than planting and there's a bread tree. But in that is actually the message of Motzi lechem min haaretz. Man may think that he is the one who makes bread, but it is so clear that it is really God who is Motzi lechem min haaretz. Meaning in this entire divine process, if I were to ask you, how is bread made? The real way you may want to start is by saying, well, the water starts in the glacier, and so on and so forth. That's the humbling message of the bracha of Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, or yayin l'samach levav enosh. The wine which brings joy to the heart of man, or lahatsil panim mishemen, or oil. These are the three kind of divine, these are the three main, I guess, pieces of produce that are constantly talked about in Kriyat Shema. We have oil, we have wine, and we have bread. Each of them can't be made on their own. That's the common denominator. Oil isn't just made. A human being has to process it. A wine has to be processed. Bread has to be processed. But here's a divine reminder that while it seems like the human beings are creating, it's actually God who's put this entire process that we're helping effectuate into order, and we're just kind of bringing it to that extra step. There's a hidden message as to why we, start Shabbat with bread, and why we start Shabbat with wine, and why we light fire with oil there as well. What we're doing is taking all of these elements, which we might have thought we created, and acknowledging the divine presence behind it. Hadlakat Nerot, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and Kiddush, and Havdalah as well. Okay, that's for another time. We're still moving forward. Yispe'u atzei Adonai, arzeh halevanon asher nata. Now, it's interesting. You would think if man was at the center of this mizmor, which he is if you read this as a chiasm, I'll admit that. But then it goes on to describe what else is being sustained by God. The trees. What can I talk about here other than redwood? the giant redwood trees here. The trees of God are Arzeh HaLevanon. If you've ever seen a redwood, that's what I envisioned when we talk about the Arzeh HaLevanon, the cedars that were in Lebanon, these beautiful cedar trees, which probably pale in comparison to the redwood trees out on the West Coast. But there's something divine when you look up at a tree and you see its height, you think about its age and you say, wow, what it took to create this. It should bring you back to all of the processes that brought this tree into existence. I remember when I was out in the redwood forest. Remember, they had a sign by one of them that said that this redwood is potentially as old as Abraham, when Abraham walked the earth. And you're like, wow, there's something really beautiful there. In other words, God isn't just creating a home for man. He's creating a home for birds too. I'm not going to go into what each of these birds mean, but what I will tell you is the following. And here is a clever little thing I once did. Once, and I'll get to the famous red convertible story, and I'll embarrass myself in front of all of you, but I was stranded in Yosemite, and I took the following picture. And I just want to show you the shift in perspective between these two pictures, because there's a message that goes back to our Tashma or Tz'u idea hidden here. You see here in this picture, the Mishnayot that I'm learning, yes, Mishnayot, even though it's a Yemei Iyun b'Tanakh, that I'm learning are faded, and the view is what comes into perspective. In this next picture, and I'll translate the verses afterwards, oops, sorry. In this next picture, it's the Mishnah, which is the focus, and the background is blurred. If I were to choose two pictures that capture Tashma and Tz'u, these are them, because look at the Mishnah that I was learning. The Mishnah goes as follows. If you could read it, it says the following. Rabbi Elazar Ish Bar Tanura Omar, says like this. Rabbi Shimon Omer HaMe'alech Baderech. Somebody who's going on his way, Vishoneh Umafsik Mimishnato, and stops learning Mishnah. And he says, Mana ilan zeh umana irzah. He says, how beautiful is this tree? Or how beautiful is this plowed land? Ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu mitchayev benafsho. Right? So Rav Kook famously explained, he's saying, what's the problem here? The problem isn't that the person stopped learning and looked at the trees. He says the problem is that he stopped learning and thought that the trees that he was looking at had no connection to his learning. I'll say that again. It's the problem here isn't that mana ilan zeh, how dare you stop learning Bittul Torah. It's mana ilan zeh. The problem is it arises when you don't see, when you don't understand the connection. And in fact, these two pictures in my mind kind of capture that idea. This idea of sometimes you have to actually look up from the Mishnayot. You have to look up from the Torah and see the divine world around you. But those two things should go hand in hand. This picture and this picture. People jokingly, after I was stranded in that area for 3 hours, a story I'll tell in a little bit, they asked me how it was. And I said, I learned a lot and I saw the trees dancing. Now, before you think I'm crazy, while I was sitting there for 3 hours, I noticed a small waterfall in the background of that photo that I showed you. And I noticed the way the wind, the malachim that we were describing before, the angels kind of moved, or the messengers moved the trees back and forth. I was so present in the moment that I was able to actually appreciate on a deeper level the teva, the nature around me. In other words, the story, which we'll get to, brought me out of the Mishnayot, which I had in my pocket, and into the world around me in a way deeper than perhaps my travels had beforehand, by giving me a little bit of added perspective. If you pause for a second, if you've ever bird watched, I've never really done it, but what I hear is the beauty in it is the waiting, to find that beautiful bird. Describing different birds and their trees. But listen, harim hagvoim layelim. Mountains are beautiful, beautiful areas for ye'elim, for for the ibex to find home. Slaim machsel shvanim. But not only is there a seder to the waters and where they've come down, there's also another form of seder. And this is actually the second part of the Mizmor. We're doing great. Asaya reach lemoadim shemesh yada mevo'o. God in his divine wisdom has provided sustenance for all of us. And obviously the seasons, the moon and the sun all relate to the way that God is mechalkel chayim. But here we shift back to the heavens and we say, God made specific times for the moon. Think of the waxing and waning of the moon. And the sun knows when to arrive every single morning. Shemesh yada mevo'o. This is a sunrise. You can expect it. Us Jews are probably the only people in the world who, when you ask a Jew when is sunrise or sunset, they know. Try asking somebody else, what exact time will sunrise and sunset be this coming day? Not as easy. We deal in a very unique timing that makes us almost chase the sunrise or chase the sunset, and we can count on HaKadosh Baruch Hu every single day, a moed for the moon, the month, and the moon in its monthly cycles, the sun coming up as it's supposed to. Tashet choshech v'hi laila. Every night, the darkness comes. It is as if God turns off the light. He puts darkness and it comes in. I'm trying to describe the sun coming before and as if the sun shows up. Hey, I'm here. Bo tirmos kol chai toyar. Now it's describing actually nocturnal life. The sun comes down and all of nocturnal life comes to life. Hakfirim shoagim lataref. The lions, just heard a lion roar at the zoo for the first time a couple weeks ago. Incredible, different type of sound. Hakfirim shoagim lataref. You hear the kfirim, these young lions, roaring for their prey. Ulavakesh me'el ochlam. Beautiful. The lions are turning to God for their food. So I was like, obviously we as human beings should too, but everybody is in a certain way turning towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, trying to make it work. Listen to the following. Tizrach hashemesh yasefun v'el me'onotam yirbatz. The second the sun comes out, the lions go away, and everybody goes back into their place. In other words, what's being described here in the Mizmor is a different type of order. Not the order of how the water comes down and sustains everybody, but the order of night and day. You could think a lot about Maaseh Bereshit. I'm not making the connections here. But Tizrach HaShemesh, the sun comes up, and all of those nocturnal beasts which come out, Ya'asefun, they all go back to their place. El Mona Tamir Batsun, they hide out in their cabins wherever they may be. Yetzei Adam lefoato v'la'avodato adei arev. Human beings sneak in one more time. Right? Again, they're there, but they're part of this process. Beforehand, it was the way the human being interacted as part of this process of creating food. Here, it's the way the human being is part of the process of day and night. Yetzei Adam lefoalo. In the morning, just like the Shemesh comes out, human beings go out to do their work. V'la'avodato, and they finish up their work adei arev as the evening comes in. In other words, we're part of this divine organized night and day that God has created. Beautiful. At this point, we've gotten almost 2 moments of Chokhmat HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Chokhmah of day and night, the Chokhmah of the Mayim trickling down from the mountains all the way down to the Colorado River. At this point, the Baal HaMizmor yells out what we've just said before, but perhaps in a deeper way than we've ever felt it before. Marabu ma'asecha Adonai, kulam bechokhma asita, mal'ah ha'aretz kinyanecha. Tell me that the Baal HaMizmor wasn't looking at something like what we're seeing. There's no way. There's no way. He must have been hiking up a mountain at the bottom of a stream, stargazing at night, hanging out by the water as the tide comes in and out, thinking about the border. Marabu ma'asecha Hashem kulam bechokhma asita. And all of this brings him to think about the divine wisdom that has put this all together. This is the point that actually breaks from the Mizmor. And in third person, he turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says, Marabu ma'asecha Adonai, kulam bechokhma asita, mal'ah ha'aretz kinyanecha. All of this, it's always funny when you see people traveling and they take a picture and say, that's beautiful nature. Baruch Nafshi is telling us to move one step further. The nature is beautiful. And what does this tell us about HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Rov ha'ma'asim, all of the things he created, the chokhmah that he did to create it, and kanita, kinyan, ownership in the fact that he created everything here. When you deeply sense, when you look at something and you don't just see the world as stagnant, but you see the way that the dynamics of the world bring it to life in front of your eyes. Everything is interacting. The world is constantly pulsing in a deep way. And Maaseh Breshit is as if it's occurring every single day. As John Muir said, and as we say every single day in Birkot Kriyat Shema, Mechadesh Bechol Yom Tamid. God is Mechadesh Maaseh Breshit every single day. John Muir, one of the founders of the National Park movement, would say, every morning, today is the morning of creation. Creation, not in the sense that something was created anew, but that he could see the way everything was connected. Now, before this Mizmor reaches its conclusion, it's interesting that there's almost a grand frontier, a divine frontier, a grand frontier that has not yet been discussed here. You see, for us, the final frontier may be space, maybe Mars, right? But if you think back into the years of where this Mizmor was created, the real frontier was the ocean, the expanses of the ocean. Heaven was, Lo nifleti mimcha. We're told in Parshat Nitzavim this week, there are two ways you can go. It's lo rechokai mimcha, you can't go across the ocean or go into heaven, but to dream of going to heaven was another level. That's something that in the 20th, 21st century, we can think about within the realm of our possibility. But we forget, you look at the expanse of an ocean and you think, wow, what lies in the beyond? But even there's organization. So here's what this Mizmor is doing right now. It's venturing into the chaos of the unknown and saying that God is still nevertheless organized. Everything out there is still put together in a way. So here's where it goes now. Zeh Yam HaGadol. It's as if we've turned from the earth that we can see, and we're looking out to the expansiveness in the ocean. Zeh Hayam HaGadol. You could think of any ocean. U'rechav Yadayim. It is beyond wide. It's almost a little kid. How big is it? That big, so big. You can't even imagine it. Some remes ve'en mispar. So many beings that we haven't even discovered yet. Chayot ktanotim gdolot. Everything is there. I have here, I think, a picture of us scuba diving, which I always find to be fascinating. You scuba dive, you go you go underneath the water and you see an entire world is hiding underneath that blue film of water that we're just unaware of. And it's all there, and that's what's being described here. The chayot ktanot im gidolot. You see a turtle, you see the fish. Just last week, I saw dolphins coming out of the Atlantic. Everything is hiding underneath there, and there's almost an entire organized world behind it. Here it goes in Sam Onyoti Halechun. Man always he intrudes, right? We try to put boats out there. We're trying to figure everything out. Livyatan ze yetzarta l'sachekbo. But in the ocean, the Livyatan, we're not going to talk about it. Here I put Halong Bay. Halong Bay is in Western Vietnam. It's all these little islands, and it's described as these thousands of little islands that are the backs of the long dragon. So it makes me think of the Livyatan in a deep way, kind of protruding and coming out of the water. But there's something very deep in all of the legends. There are lots of legends about dragons and Halong Bay out in west of Vietnam. But the idea here is Livyatan zel l'sachekbo, is there's God created everything in order to play with. It's something I like to talk about with my students sometimes, which is the world isn't just, the background for our lives. God created an entire world, and sometimes it's l'sachekbo. There's certain parts in this world that aren't about us. It's just beauty. L'sachekbo. God created a Livyatan to play with. Kulam elecha yesaberun latein.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Rabbi. I just want to give you your 10-minute warning.
Thank you. Perfect. Kulam elecha yesaberu lateit lahem ochlam beito titen lahem yilketun tifatach yadcha yisbeun tov. Here's where we change pace. Now the Baal HaMizmor turns and says the following: everything, even the Livyatan, everything in the water, the things we can see and the things we can't see, kulam elecha yisaberun. They all look to you for sustenance. They all look to you for food be'ito, in the right moment in time. You feel that organization, the seder, that God, everybody is kind of leaning on this divine seder. Titen lahem yilketun. Listen to this. This is the Baal HaMizmor now in a humbling way reflecting on what all of this means to him. Sometimes you give to them, titen lahem. It feels like the man yil ketun. When you give to them, they gather. Are we talking about the fish of the sea? Are we talking about human beings? Are we talking about the deer, the birds from beforehand? Everything is being provided for in a deep way at its source, at its essence from God. Tifatach yadcha yisbeun tov. It is only with God opening his hand, poteach et yadecha, that everybody can reap the benefits of God's sustenance. Here's where it gets interesting. What would happen if God wasn't part of this? That's the last part of this mizmor. What would happen if all of a sudden nature was devoid of God? It's working on its own. Tastir panecha yebelhelum. If you were to close off your face, everybody would be scared. Think of an intense darkness, especially in contrast to the beginning. Note or kasalma. God cloaks the entire world with or, with light. But if you were to take away that light, tastir panecha yebehelun, tosef rucham, if you were to take away the ruach, remember the antelope slot canyons, if you were to take that away, yigva'un. This is in a deep way, you play with it. There's a ruach which is within us, but there's also the ruach which is moving all the pieces in the world into its places. If you were to do that, tosef rucham yigva'un, ve'eli afaram yeshuvun. In other words, life as we know it cannot exist without God sustaining it day in and day out. I remember this is the convertible story. My wife and I were traveling through Yosemite, and my divine realization moment was we found a really cheap rental for a red Mustang convertible. We were zipping through Yosemite and we ran over a giant boulder. I'm not doing the story justice, and there are many versions of the story. And the car in the end ended up having to be towed. And I took it as like a divine little like knock on the shoulder saying, oh, right. This is my earth. Like, you're going through in a hotshot red car here, pretending in a certain way you are the one who's kona everything. No. One little tiny rock. It's all wrecked. Tishalach ruchacha yibareim. But at the same time, if you were to send out your spirit, everything will be created again. Remember the antelope slot canyons. Utichadesh b'nei adama. In other words, all of life is in a certain way conditioned on the ruach, which Hashem will or won't give, the light, which God will or will not grant. Yehi chvod Adonai le'olam. May it be. All of a sudden, we're looking at this Mizmor Kuf Dalet, and we're thinking, oh, everything's in order. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, but what if God wasn't there? And we're feeling that things, even though they're in perfect order, there's a little bit of frailty. Things may not always be that way if HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't do that. So we say, Yehi chvod Adonai le'olam, Yismach Adonai b'ma'asav. God, may you continue to grace us with your presence, because we understand, and here's amazing. It's amazing. I don't need to make this up. Hey, what does it mean to have a divine knock on the shoulder, my Mustang moment, that awakens us to the idea that nature as it is doesn't need to be that way. Hamabit la'aretz v'tirad. God looks to the land and it shakes. What's being described here? Clear, an earthquake. And the land underneath your feet is moving. And all of a sudden, the stability which you thought you had, makom v'yasara talahem, is not so clear. Yiga beharim v'yashanu. Just show you a map. When we were traveling through Calgary, this is what it looked like. There were forest fires everywhere. And unfortunately, it's a more and more common occurrence. You could think to Yerushalayim, to northwest California, to Northern California, right? Yiga beharim v'yashanu. If God just touches a mountain, it could go up in a blaze. Meaning the stability that we think we have, think of an earthquake, think of a forest fire. These are moments where it's not so clear, right? Ashira ladonai, so therefore, once these little moments remind me of the fact that it's not always, it doesn't have to be that way. Here's what I'm going to do. Ashira ladonai b'chayai. I'm going to take this exact moment and give praise to God for the life. Here's where we're going back. All the Baal HaMizmor, we've only really heard about him in Marabu Masecha Hashem moment, but now we're coming back to him. Ashir Adonai b'chayai. I sense my life in a way that is deeper and profounder than I ever have before, because I glanced outward and then I was able to see inward more deeply. Barchi nafshi, and connected to Kuf Gimel as well. Azamra le'Elohai be'odi. I will give songs or sing melodies to God while I am still here, present. Right? My life is ephemeral, just like the world is all founded on HaKadosh Baruch Hu's divine sustenance. We are too. Ye'erav alav sichi. What can I contribute? What can I contribute to this divine order? Right? Beforehand, we were just another pawn in creation. What can I contribute? Ye'erav alav sichi. I can become part of the conversation. Anochi esmach b'Adonai. I can find joy in God. In other words, I can praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I can be aware of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does to keep this world the way it is and make it part of my daily shicha, tefillah. Anochi esmach b'Adonai. Yitamu chata'im min haaretz. U'rsha'im odenam. Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Hallelujah. If I were to go to each one of these, they're just a different moment where I decided to pray. This is Lake Louise in Calgary. Another one here, Hallelujah. Take a look at this one here. Overlooking a sunrise on one hand, the moon over here, the sun over there. Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Hallelujah. It is after this entire Mizmor that we are again able to say the words Barchi nafshi, but it's different. It's changed. And initially it was Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Go look at the world. By the end, we're able to come back and say Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Bless God. And our nefesh is able to respond, Hallelujah. We've reached a deeper level. We've had that conversation with our neshama. And because of that, we're truly able to exclaim Hallelujah. You know, I'll just leave you. I know we were 1 minute left. This is the Seyurei Utashma. Hopefully you can think of moments in your life, pictures you've taken. Feel free to send them to me as well, that bring tefillah to life. You can do this in so many places. I'll just give you one more that is a really powerful way to do this. In Yom Kippur, coming up in just a week and a half, 2 weeks, there's a famous moment of Mark A. Kohen, where we should try to describe what the feeling associated with the Kohen Gadol coming out of the Kodesh HaKodashim was like. And if you just look at the metaphors used, it's so clear what the Baal HaMizmor is doing is trying to appeal not to the literary part of a person, but to the experienced life of a human being. Listen to this. As the glitter of light emanating from the brilliance of the angels at a sunset, right? As a candle, a soul candle that lights, that shines in the windows. Each of these come from the realm of lived human experience. And in a certain way, that those emotions that those metaphors bring about are meant to kind of bring the person who's davening into the mindset of the Kohen. It's not just a text we're reading, it's a world that we're experiencing. And I'll say one more time, the Torah brings out the world and the world brings out the Torah. I know there's another shiur. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. I'm not sure if there's enough time for questions, but toda rabba.